Welcome everyone. I can see people starting to come through. Good to have you with us this afternoon. So we're delighted today to be joined by Heather McNaughton, who's Partnership Manager at Historic Environment Scotland. And Heather's going to be our first speaker today. She's going to, I guess, give a general overview in terms of funding and finance in the historic and heritage sector. And then we're going to hand over to Jane. So Jane has actually been through, I guess you'll tell us the details, Jane. I don't want to introduce everyone's organisations. You can always do that better yourselves, I think. But Jane has been on, I guess, had a partnership and relationship with Social Investment Scotland over some time now, and we'll really talk about her experience in terms of looking at investment as well. And there'll be lots of opportunity to ask questions. So it gives you a real sense of what that investment journey is like from a receiver's perspective, rather than me just telling you about how to apply and what we're looking for. And while I'll come on to a bit more of that background around what social investment is and how it works, and also obviously tell you about other social investors that you could look at here in Scotland, I always think it's helpful to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So really delighted that we're joined by Heather and Jane today. And then last but not least, you'll also see Toby in your screen. So Toby's joining us from Community Share Scotland. And Toby's going to be joining us towards the latter part of today's webinar. Although if pertinent questions come in, he's also he's willing to.
As well. Yeah. Afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, Toby. So he'll be taking us through the community shares model as well. So it should give you a really, hopefully a broad range of information if you're looking at anything kind of, I guess, beyond grant finance. But I'll also be touching a little bit on maybe how grant finance can work in conjunction with social investment as well. We very much don't see this as an either or. It's very much around a blended approach. So the session is recorded. You can access it after, and any slides that are shared today we will share with you after the session, and I'll share a link out to the recording, so you can always share it with colleagues or go back and refresh. And without any further delay, I was going to hand over to our first speaker, Heather. So if you're ready, Heather, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's me. Okay, thanks very much for joining us today, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen to undertake a presentation, so bear with me. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. I'm Heather McNaughton. I'm Partnership Manager at Historic Environment Scotland, and I work as part of the Development and Partnerships Directorate. Historic Environment Scotland are a charity and lead public body dedicated to the advancement of heritage, culture, education and environment protection. I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a sense of what the Historic Environment Scotland in numbers is actually all about, particularly in relation to Historic Environment Scotland as the organisation. Many of you should know that we are a grant provider, and we provide about 14.5 million in grant funding. I would highlight that these figures were pre-COVID. And at that time, we have around 5.2 million visitors to our staffed sites across Scotland, which of course include the major sites of Edinburgh, Stirling, Urquhart and Orkney. We are a very large organisation and have just shy of 2,000 employees and volunteers, and that peaks in the summer months when we have seasonal staff. We have 204,000 members, as well as looking after Canmore. We also have a regulatory function, making sure that we look after Scotland's scheduled monuments, designed landscapes, World Heritage sites, and over 47,000 listed buildings and some battlefields. We are one of Scotland's largest skills trainers around traditional skills in construction, and very recently, many of you I'm sure will be aware that we opened the engine shed in Stirling, which is our centre of excellence for conservation. That's just a little bit of a whirlwind tour around who we are and what we do. all of it sits within our corporate plan, which was launched in 2019, and some of you may have contributed to the formulation of that plan. And we have 5 priorities under our mission statement of Heritage for All. And that's around the historic environment making a real difference to people's lives, that we fundamentally make sure that the historic environment is looked after, protected and managed for generations to come. More than ever, I think we're aware just how much the historic environment makes a broader contribution to the economy of Scotland and its people, and that it's used to inspire creativity as well. We're also a very relatively new organisation, having come together in 2015 in an amalgamation of a number of organisations. And so as an organisation, we're learning and developing and really trying to set ourselves a very high standard and make sure that the historic environment is cared for. So they're really our priorities in terms of what we're looking to do, and everything that we do sits within those priorities. But today I really want to talk to you about investment into the heritage sector, and what makes investment in heritage any different to any other organisation, really, whether that's a community group or a business or a SKIO, you know, whatever your structure. Why is heritage-led ventures any different to anything else? And one of the key words that you hear in heritage is around significance. So what's the significance of heritage to people and to place? And we tend to find heritage and the significance of heritage structured around 3 key areas. It could be an architectural feature, it could be an archaeological feature, or it could be around what we call a sort of more cultural heritage around our sort of society. So people talk a lot in heritage around significance, and therefore, having established what that significance is, the importance of conserving, cherishing and protecting that heritage both now and for future generations. And many organisations who have a heritage asset have management plans to show and demonstrate how they're going to look after those assets. Other things in heritage, there may be conditions attached to your heritage. You may have a requirement to provide access, and actually you want to provide access. It's a core part and a core function of what you do. And then you need to be able to interpret the past and make it relevant for today's audiences. And I think we've seen that very recently too, about how society's values change over time, and the need to think about those heritage assets perhaps in a different way and to tell other people's stories. But heritage doesn't operate on its own. It has an interrelationship as a driver for tourism, for placemaking and the economy. And also around heritage, we need to be able to show what impact it makes. And there's been lots of research around the impact it makes in terms of well-being, sustainability, a sense of place and identity. So when you're looking at investment for heritage ventures, it really falls into 3 key areas. There's statutory organisations like Historic Environment Scotland who have a range of grant programmes and some loan finance that absolutely you should be looking for. There's the private routes for investment, whether that's through donations, trusts, foundations, through business sponsorship or through bank finance. And then there's the income that you generate for yourselves, and that can come from a range of different sources. Admissions more often than not need to be backed with retail and hospitality so that you're creating a visitor experience. And there may be events, you may be able to offer your services. And you may be able to offer your premises or your buildings out for rental in some way, whether that's accommodation or some leases and lets. So there's a real mix of different investment sources that most heritage-led organisations will pull together a blend of these finances to help them both start, develop and grow in the sector. In terms of what's available through Historic Environment Scotland, I've provided a link there to our website. Our grant programmes are open just now. The route to our grants is through the expression of interest, and we would welcome expressions of interest at any time. What's more difficult to forecast just now is when decisions will come out around any applications that have been made. Most of these programmes have been around for some time. The most recent one that we launched was the Coast and Waters Heritage Fund, and that fitted in with the themed year of Coast and Waters, which has obviously been delayed this year. Those applications that went in for that fund are currently being assessed and decisions will be made, I hope, in the not too distant future. But we have some grant funds that we've had for a long time. So the Historic Environment Repair Grant really helps people to look after the buildings that they have acquired. The Historic Environment Support Fund helps people with one-off projects and events and perhaps some training. And the Organisational Support Fund enables us to support the intermediary network to provide wider support to the sector. So people like the Built Environment Forum Scotland, Scottish Civic Trust, the Heritage Trust Network are all supported as examples through the Organisational Support Fund. We work with local authorities through the Conservation Area Regeneration Scheme, and we also have the Archaeological Programme funding. I'm not an expert in any of those grants, but we do have a grants team that are more than happy to talk to anybody about any inquiries they may have in relation to grants. And those grants, it's rare to do 100%, so other types of funding to support those and to demonstrate commitment is always welcomed. There's a range of other providers of funding. Now, we produced last year a document called Communities and Funding Additional Information, which is on our website, which shows the support that's out there for heritage-led ventures, which people may be interested to take a look at. It doesn't include all of the COVID-19 support funds, but it will give you a general sense of what funding is available and also what support organisations can help you. So some key ones that I think most of you would recognise, which is around the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the National Lottery Community Fund. But the range of funding varies both at a national level, at a local level, and through various different organisations. And there's some examples on the screen there. I think one of the most exciting ones coming through at the moment is through the City and Growth deals, where some significant funding is going in to some, or has been indicated to go into some different projects throughout Scotland. But in addition to that grant funding source, it's really important to think about the private fundraising as well for your organisations, because that demonstrates commitment. And it provides your supporters a means to support you and to show that they value what it is that you do. So a couple of years ago, a project concluded that was a partnership of a number of organisations across Scotland that created a toolkit for heritage organisations to think about fundraising and how to go about fundraising. So I've provided a link to that. That's through inspiringfundraising.co.uk. And behind each of these sections is some real good learning and examples of how to pull together a fundraising strategy. So I think what I also wanted to highlight is some key messages around how you develop your investment strategy with heritage in mind. I think the first one is considering what blend actually works best for you. A blend's really important because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. To funders, if you can bring in your private or supported donations, it shows that you've got that commitment. You may well be generating an income into the future, which means loan finance is perfectly acceptable for the type of business that you have. So think about that blend and what that balance of that blend might look like. Heritage is extraordinarily complex, particularly if you have a building or an asset that you're required to look after. And building the right team around you early on with people that understand the conservation and protection landscape around heritage is really important. And probably if you have the right team at the outset, will stop you making mistakes into the future. If you're applying for heritage related funding, you've really got to understand why your heritage is significant. And there's lots and lots of resources available that will help you to uncover why your heritage is significant and to tell the relevant stories and be able to evidence it. And importantly, manage it going into the future. So there's lots of help available. And the best place to go, I always think, is to visit successful projects, learn from others. There's lots of them across Scotland, using the networks that are available to you, things like the Heritage Trust Network, the Scottish Civic Trust, Built Environment Forum Scotland, Arts and Business Scotland, Architectural Heritage Fund. They can all point you in the direction of people that have been successful. You need to be able to articulate why you want funding, what it's for, and why heritage might need a little bit more help than people might expect. So being able to articulate it right across the business. Funding can be a little bit sporadic in the sector. It can come and go a little bit. So be ready to react. I think more than anything during this COVID-19 pandemic, what we've seen is funding coming along that we can apply for, but you've got to be ready to go for it. The business plan needs to be up to date and cash flows need to be up to date so that you can react quickly if you need to. Raising an investment needs a plan, a time and effort. I think we can all understand that, but most importantly also needs a little bit of luck at the end of that very long journey. I hope that's helpful to everybody. There's a little short piece there for some further information around who we are and our grants, and I'm sure this will be circulated after the event. I'm more than happy to make the presentation available. Thank you.
I just spotted I was on mute. Thank you very much, Heather. There was already lots I picked up on that, and I'll perhaps come to some of that in the Q&A a little bit. I guess one of the key things you said just in terms of a tip was about learning from others and visiting successful projects, and perhaps, well, that's a little harder to do right now. I think really hearing from people that have been there and done it is really valuable, and I guess that's where we invited Jane into this session today as someone that has gone down certainly the investment route and the loan finance route with Social Investment Scotland. And I wanted to just welcome Jane into our session now to just talk about their investment journey, the difference I guess it's made to their organisation, and just to share some of that experience, I guess, any fears they had, particularly around the loan finance aspect, and looking at where I guess it's taken their initiative and how it's helped them as part of that broader investment package. So over to you, Jane, and thank you, Heather, and we'll be back to you, Heather, for Q&A as well. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Naomi, and that was really interesting listening to what Heather was saying. We've been involved with Historic Environment Scotland as well, so it was interesting to hear all of that information. So my name is Jane Isaacson, and I'm the Sustainability and Development Manager for the MacDougall of Dunollie Preservation Trust, and we're based in Oban. I've been in post for just coming up for 8 years, and I've been on a very exciting journey with the trust. developing Dunollie Museum, Castle and Grounds from the opening in 2012 to the vibrant museum that it's become now, and making it a real cog in our community. That's been one of our priorities. And we've created and developed Dunollie Links, which is our community engagement programme. I've also worked on the planning and fundraising for Dunollie Castle conservation, which is where our involvement with Historic Environment Scotland has been. And we are just this week finishing phase 3 of that project. And over the last couple of years, we've been working towards our 2020 vision, which is a major capital project to renovate the old Victorian steadings at the bottom of our castle path to become museum annexes. And this is the drawings on my wall, if you are interested. It's on hold at the moment because of the pandemic, but we're not giving up on it. We're really well down the road. We've got planning permission, and we've started to try and start building our blend of funding, which was, I liked that expression that Heather used. To start off with, I think I'm going to just tell you a little bit about our project. It's quite a difficult project to tell you a little about because it's a very broad project with multiple activities and multiple social benefits. So I'm just going to kind of give you a little summary of what we do. First of all, Dunollie, it's first and foremost a place name, and the meaning is always under discussion in our office. However, we think that it links back to the folk that came from Northern Ireland in the 6th century and established the Kingdom of Argyll. It's a township and was there long before Oban, but it now forms the north end of Oban, and we're sort of in the middle of there. Our Dunollie, based at Dunollie Museum, Castle and Grounds, is a heritage site. It's a collection of buildings, Dunollie House and its outbuildings and its farm buildings, and then in the middle, resplendent, stands Dunollie Castle, keeping an eye out over Oban Bay to see who's coming and going. We have artefacts, we have archives and heritage resources dating right back to the 13th century, associated with the political building of Scotland and the populating of the West Coast and everything since then, really. We've clan history, lots of it, an incredible collection of costume, which gives a wonderful insight and illustration of the Clan MacDougall and their lifestyle over the generations. It's also, Dunollie is a partnership of people and organisations. We work with a lot of different people, individuals, groups, organisations. It's a family and it's a visitor experience, and it's also a brand. We do a lot of work on product for our both our on-site and our online shops, drawing inspiration from our collections and our history to create beautiful high-end product to sell for generating income. We work together on this kind of exciting mixture of projects towards an agreed strategic plan to become Oban's Jewel, which we are. We have a fabulous dedicated permanent staff team of 7, and then we have a seasonal staff team of another sort of 9 or 10, depending on, you know, part-time, etc., for the visitor season, which sadly we don't have this year. The Trust is a charity. It was set up to preserve the heritage at Dunollie and to provide public access and opportunities, learning, etc. around the heritage. And the heritage assets were put into trust by the MacDougalls of Dunollie family and the hereditary chiefs of the Clan MacDougall. Madam MacDougall of MacDougall, Morag, as we know her, sits on our board. The success of the commercial element of what we do is absolutely key to supporting the conservation work that we do, and delivery of public benefits is our primary purpose. But this depends entirely on being able to generate enough income to pay for the costs of the work. We're an independent museum, and our greatest priority is to involve our community and the international community of cultural heritage enthusiasts and academic circles who are very interested in the resources we have. And over the last 8 years, we've created and developed our community engagement programme, Dunollie Links, and now have something happening most days of the year, which is part of Dunollie Links, from nursery children right the way through to academics from university, vulnerable adults groups and schools and volunteers, and we have 7 or 8 formal volunteer groups that meet every week and look after our heritage and help us to provide the high value visitor experiences that we offer to people from across the world. So we might have our archive group researching for an exhibition, and our high school pathways students doing a voice recording for a listening post, and our curatorial team looking out objects for that exhibition, our exhibition team creating and planning. So that's how we work. So we're involving as many people as possible. Last year we had 3,000 local participants for our various engagement activities, and we welcomed 22,000 visitors from across the world. And we made, Dunollie Museum, Castle and Grounds made a significant contribution to the economy of Oban in the region of £500,000 in the year. Since opening to the public in 2012, we've grown very, very fast, and sometimes it feels as if we're running away with ourselves. And I think one of the pressures we have had is managing multiple projects at one time, and how we get that blend that Heather was talking about, and how we bankroll when we're relying on retrospective grants and reclaims of that. So just to give you an idea of the scale of the growth, over the 8 years since we opened to the public, when we had 4 staff and 2,000 visitors, last year we had 15, 16 staff and 22,000 visitors. And so everything's happened very, very fast, as well as conservation of the castle and the development of Dunollie Link. So we might have 3 or 4 grant-aided projects going at the same time. And if you can imagine, for quite a small organisation, if we have a big bill for the castle, it could wipe out everything that we need to pay the wages for 3 months, etc. So we've had to be really careful about how we plan this. And so this is where we started to assist, we became involved with Social Investment Scotland. When we were planning the first phase of the castle works in 2013, I was looking for bridging options for the retrospectively paid grants from HES. I'd heard a bit about Social Investment Scotland, so I decided to see if I could find out a bit more. And Rob Halliday, I don't know if Rob still works with SIS, but he looked after me and was fantastically helpful, and the whole process was just made so pleasant for us. Our board was slightly nervous about the concept of borrowing money, which was something we hadn't done it before, but because the loan was based on secure grants, it wasn't too much of a risk, and we agreed that we would pursue it. We knew that if the project failed for any reason, then we wouldn't need to borrow the money, and therefore we wouldn't need to pay it back. And if it succeeded, then we would get the grants and we'd be able to pay the money back. So it was okay, and the team at SIS were so helpful and responded to our need to have the funds in place quickly in order to meet the grant and contractor timescale. So that was a success for us, and it changed the way we kind of thought about our packages of finance, that they could include lending if necessary. A year later, once we'd finished phase 1 of the castle works, we were still in this position of having a very ambitious growth plan. We were building a cafe, we were running the growing business, our numbers of visitors were increasing, Dunollie Links activities were increasing, and we needed staff and so on and so forth. And I realised that in order to achieve all of this, we were going to have to try and make things easier for ourselves. And we thought, well, let's see if we could maybe borrow again from Social Investment Scotland. So I had another chat with Rob, who thought that something could be worked out. And I went down to Edinburgh and met him, and he told me about the new Community Capital Fund. We talked about how that could possibly help us with operational cash flow, just to support our growth plan. And because of our social enterprise activities and the social impact of our work, Rob felt that this was a fund that we would be eligible for and could help us. So I took the idea back to the trustees a bit nervously. We decided that we would try and borrow £30,000, and we were initially nervous again about the idea of borrowing, but this time we were going to be borrowing on projections, which were my projections of what I thought we possibly could achieve. And so the whole thing was a bit more scary. I adjusted the growth plan projections to show the loan repayments and when we would be able to start repaying it. And we negotiated with SIS, who agreed to let us have the first 3 years interest only. and start paying after 3 years when the growth plan started to show that it would be able to pay the money back. And we went ahead with it. We made the application and we were successful. And the loan allowed us to spend the money necessary to keep the momentum of our growth plan up. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about the details of that, of getting that money in a minute, but I just wanted to say that this year we've borrowed for a third time from SIS, again for bridging for the phase 3 of the castle consolidation. And because we're so far along with our relationship with Social Investment Scotland, the process was just so straightforward. The loan setup was smooth and quick, and the castle works are almost finished, and we'll be paying that loan back in October. So yes, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our relationship with SIS and the sort of a bit more detail about the process of getting these loans in place and what we had to do and how it felt, etc. So firstly, in the 6 years since I've been working with SIS, I have been in communication with lots of people, and every single person has been delightful, helpful, never judgmental when I don't understand something, which is quite often, and very enthusiastic and interested in what we are doing, which is just wonderful. I've often been slow getting back with information if I've been busy, but I've never felt like I've been slow. I've never felt chastised or hassled. It's a very different organisation to work with. Our investment manager, Eileen Gardner, is so supportive and brilliant to work with, and we have a catch up about once every quarter, sometimes a bit more often if there's things happening like a new loan or starting repayments, etc. Eileen knows our business really well, and she's genuinely interested and enthusiastic about what we do, which is heartening. In terms of administration, this has had ups and downs for me. The first bridging loan was very straightforward, both for the application and the follow-up. However, I did find at the time when we first started that there was an awful lot more to the community capital fund than I'd expected. It took months longer than originally suggested, which made cash flow for us really tricky. However, it was a new fund, it was a new experience for us and for SIS, and we got through it together, and the loan played a major part in our growth plan back in 2014. So it was very worth the struggle to get there. There was also a lot more in the way of reporting and feedback than we'd expected, but looking back now, I realised that this was just because we were inexperienced. We hadn't borrowed before, so we didn't know what to expect. And obviously you have to report and feedback, and we hadn't considered it. And it seems very obvious now. I found the reporting really difficult to begin with because we were so small and we were under-resourced and understaffed. So for businesses like ours, it's all about timing. So I found myself having to create quarterly reports in amongst final claims for the castle and other project deadlines all stacked on top of each other. It wasn't a good experience in the beginning and made me feel that I wasn't fulfilling the obligations attached to the loan. However, I wasn't made to feel that way at all by SIS. And 6 years later, it's a breeze. You know, we have grown with SIS, and we've grown enough to employ a full-time administrator, and we have a system for our quarterly reporting, etc. And our relationship with SIS has helped us to be more organised in our admin and to be up to date with management accounts and reporting, etc. So that's been a very positive journey for us. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how working with SIS and borrowing from SIS has made us feel about our funding packages and borrowing money. Social Investment Scotland, I'm sure Naomi's going to tell you this or later, provides loans as part of its mission to make a lasting sustainable impact on communities by helping organisations continue doing their great work or to expand that work. So for us, it's a fantastic feeling being supported by this organisation. It's almost like being kind of cheered on by family and friends who understand what you're going through and where you're trying to get to and what you're achieving. Our own trustees struggled in the beginning with the concept of social enterprise and social return on investment. So to be provided with money under these terms gave us a great boost, and it gave us something to go back to them with It confirmed to the team on the ground that we're doing great work, and has definitely changed the outlook of our trustees and built their understanding of funds in return for social good. It has been a very positive journey. As well as the psychological boost that it's given us, the Community Capital Investment Loan gave us Social Investment Scotland's endorsement in terms of being investable. And we felt it put us on the map of worthwhile projects in which high value individuals might take an interest. It forced us to go through the HMRC Social Investment Tax Relief Regulations audit, which was a nightmare at the time. It turned us into trailblazers though, which we loved. So it made us get absolutely everything from financial management and decision making and governance and procedures and protocols all in place, because we had to have that for HMRC requirements. And to be told that we were investment ready by HMRC was a super exciting moment for me. I still have the Trailblazers certificate on my wall. It made us feel grown up. It made us feel courageous, and yeah, it was really good. There's always a worry in the back of your mind about borrowing money, something you don't really want to be thinking about when you're trying to sleep at night. But changing the concept into a loan being a tool rather than a debt changed the way I worked and gave me such a lot of confidence to go to my board and say, look, this is just a tool in the toolkit, and it's a really useful, helpful tool and something that we should be looking at and using. And yeah, I can't remember who it was that said those words at one of the CIS presentations, but it's stuck with me all the way through. So it's a good feeling to know that we're not only in a financial and regulatory position to promote ourselves to potential investors and supporters, but we're also doing the right kind of work, the kind of work that people want to support. The social impact of what we do at Dunollie is an important part of our strategic plan and something that the core team is passionate about. We're delighted with our progress, and particularly that Dunollie Links has proved to have such a broad reach and wide appeal, resulting in significant social return on the investment that we've had for the project. And with the loss of services in recent years, we feel that we have a lot to offer in terms of making a difference to people's lives. And CIS has helped us on that journey just by giving us kind of validation. And so I have 3 things to leave with you from my personal experience of working with CIS over the last 6 years. I've learned a lot, and the first one is that you need, and Heather said this, and it was really nice that she said this because I'd written it down as well, you need time for planning and reporting and feedback for this kind of investment, but it's worth it because you're entering a world where people get what you're doing, and for social enterprise you need to be understood because it is different and things happen more slowly and it's not so cutthroat and it's not so, you know, it's a business, but it's got this other element that you've got to balance with it of the social good. The second one is, if you're confident in your forward plan, then don't be afraid to negotiate with CIS because they're listening to you. And you know, if you need 3 years of interest free, they might say yes, they might say no, but it's worth asking the question and be honest and be open. And I find that very much, you know, if something goes wrong, don't try and skim over it and pop it under the carpet. Just be really bold and open about it. Yes, we didn't make as much money as we thought we would through that project. It all went horribly wrong. Can you help us? Or can we stretch this repayment because we just didn't manage what we thought we were going to manage? And we've been given a holiday for the pandemic, and that has been a godsend for us because we would have struggled to make the repayments that we're making to CIS for our community loan at the moment. And number 3, go for it. Don't be nervous. The process is so thorough that you'll only get the money if you're ready to receive it. And I think that's been the big learning for us, is that if you're not in a position to receive those funds and pay them back, they won't give them to you. So it's a really worthwhile process to go through to get yourselves as ready as you can do in terms of all your all your ducks being stacked up in a row and all your governance correct and everything up to date before you go and ask for money. But it's definitely a really useful tool, and SIS is a fantastic organisation to work with on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I always have to say other providers are available, and I'll be touching on that a little bit as well. I mean, it's great. I mean, we very much see kind of investment as a partnership, and I think that's been touched on quite a bit. I've got a couple of questions perhaps now, just to get some perspectives really from yourself and Heather before we move on, and I'll talk through then once we've done the questions about a little bit more about that relationship and actually what to look for in a social investor, SIS or anyone else, because I think part of the value we like to bring is actually we're there to help organisations, and I think the point about things being thorough and you wouldn't get the money lent to you unless you were ready is really important. We're patient and work with people, especially if we know it's the first time that they've gone down this route. But, we're proud that our default rates are low, and it's because we're not in the business of trying to get organisations into trouble. We're in the business of trying to get organisations to grow and be ambitious and actually really achieve what they want to achieve. So perhaps picking up on that in terms of looking at some of the issues around social impact, and I think both yourself and Heather touched on it a little bit. That can be something that people can sometimes struggle with in terms of how they demonstrate it. Could you just both touch a little bit or give us just some top tips for heritage organisations in terms of how they really look at social impact, and maybe some ways they can measure it and the kind of things you look for in your organisations or as part of your funds? So I think that's often helpful to people.
Who do you want to start?
Question. Let's go. Heather, do you want to go first, given give Jane a bit of a breather for a minute, and then we'll bring Jane in.
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think I highlighted what some of those impacts were in my presentation, but certainly that whole part of feeling part of a community and that opportunity that brings for the community. So that could be through volunteering, which reduces social isolation. It helps people learn skills. It helps people new contacts. So I think, and that improves their general well-being. I think that's one of the really key ones in terms of certainly from a heritage aspect. I think it really challenges some of our perceptions around equalities as well, and being able to tell stories of the past helps people relate a little bit better in terms of how we've arrived at the point that we've arrived at, and where we are. And then I think there's just general placemaking in terms of impacts, where there's a heritage sort of feature or an understanding, it just creates a better place to live and to be. And when you've got that sense of identity in that place, you want to look after it better. So there's a whole raft of different social impacts, and also depending what the heritage experience actually is, more than often it's intergenerational too. So it's stretching from giving a child an education around history through to people being able to tell their stories in later life and having those captured and collected. So there's so many different ways that heritage can really have a social impact.
Thank you, Heather. Jane, any just top tips from you?
Yes, I mean, I would completely agree with everything that Heather said there. And for our specific organisation, we're very creative. So we have a lot of creative input from a lot of different people. And that's one of the main social impacts that we have. And friendship, I think this sense of place and identity is so important, but I think the friendship and working together with people with a similar interest, we have a lot of groups of people who just enjoy that, being able to get together once a week and do something that they're all fascinated by. But yeah, I think, place and identity is so important, isn't it?
Thank you. I know it's often something that people pick up on, and while our session is very much about the finance, we very much put ourselves out there as social investments, very much about the money and the social impact. So that's why I wanted to pick up on that. I just wanted to come back, Jane. Just obviously, you said in the early days, trustees were perhaps a little more nervous, and I certainly know in my experience of working with organisations from all sorts of backgrounds over the years that trustees can often be more of a barrier actually to taking on social investments sometimes than the staff. And I touch on this in terms of perceptions around personal liability that are perhaps incorrect.
Yeah.
But do you feel now that having gone down the route, to some degree, automatically trustees look at blended finance now rather than automatically thinking, well, which grant fund do we go for next?
I think they still are,
or do they still kind of...
They still need to be prompted, but they're not so risk averse as they were. And I think that's all it was. If you can get a grant, it still is a risk, because you need to deliver, but it's not seen so much as a risk as borrowing is. So, but yes, I would say they're much more comfortable with it now. And actually last year we applied for a loan from the Architectural Heritage Fund as well. We didn't go ahead with it, but we did go through the process. So for me, that was another step forward, that we were investigating other options as well. So yeah, it just takes some time, I think, to see. I think now that we've paid one of our loans back and we've almost paid the second loan back, they feel more comfortable with it, that we're, we can do this, and it's moved us forward.
It's just always one, I know it's one of the biggest challenges to organisations when they look at this. I was interested as well, just thinking, obviously, well, none of us can really predict all of our finance situations in the short term at the moment, given COVID and that real uncertainty. Do you feel in some degree, by having the number of in the previous years being able to really take a much more focused look at projected income has actually put you in a stronger position to then try and understand financial positions or different scenarios, just because I guess you've had to work through future finance planning in a lot more detail than sometimes I think grant funding pushes us towards looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been very lucky in the heritage sector because we've been so well supported, and we're looking at businesses alongside us that are just dropping like flies, and we're going to be okay. But we were able to respond so quickly because we had everything in place, and because we're reporting quarterly to you guys, and because we've had to exactly that, look at our social impact and our financial position, and we are used to working with multiple funders at the same time. It hasn't been a frightening experience for us, and also, as you say as well, projecting. In fact, when we first did our COVID planning, we did 5 scenarios with 5 different projections, depending on what was going to happen, and we ended up at scenario 5, which we'd hope we weren't going to, but we did. So but I was really glad that we'd gone through that process of looking, this is the worst case and this is the best case, and we were ready for it. So yes, it's definitely helped us with that.
Yeah, I mean, I often say that I think one of the big differences is, I know when we apply for grant funding, obviously funders are always want to see the last lot of accounts, and while we've got budgets that we set for moving forwards, they're not tending to be focused on projections around income and earning. And I think, I'm not saying we don't have a sector that doesn't always look forwards in terms of finance, but there's something about having to look at loan investment and repayment that I think brings a little more scrutiny to the future financial planning.
Yes, you can't say, you're absolutely right. And I've talked to this with the trustees a lot as well, because in terms of projecting, I try and under project because I don't like disappointing the staff team. But when you're going for grants, you need to over project so that you're showing yourself doing really well. When you're going for lending, for borrowing, you have to accurately as possible project. So it is, yes, I think a lot more scrutiny, because you need to know that you can pay that back. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I say, I think it feels hard on organisations at the time if they're not used to that level of financial planning. But I know we hear from a lot of organisations that we work with that actually, once they've got over that much more regular financial reporting, actually they feel much more confident, like you say, in themselves, much more aware of their own business.
Yeah. It's so good. It was so good. It was such a good process for us because, as I say, at the time it was a nightmare, and I didn't have the experience, I didn't have the knowledge, and none of us did. And we've been pushed into that position, and now we're super organised. So, yeah, it's been good.
Thank you. I've actually seen that we've got Toby actually wanted to ask Heather a question, so I was going to bring Toby in, and I'll just say if anyone else has got questions, feel free to just post them in the chat. We've got another 5 or 10 minutes if need be on Q&A. So Toby, do you want to go in next?
Thank you. So mostly for Heather, but Jane, you might also have a view on this. My perception of the heritage sector is that it's probably one that has seen quite a move away from grant funding towards revenue generation. And I just wondered if you had any data or figures on, you know, what the average organisation looks like now. Has there been a shift in, you know, how their income is made up between grants and between other forms of income?
The easy answer to your question is no, I don't hold those figures in my head. But I think there's probably 2 points in there. I think the first is, particularly if you have ownership or management of a heritage asset, you will more than likely always need some form of grant support. It's very difficult to make figures stack up. That's why I talked about what makes it slightly different, and it is that need to conserve and to protect and for things to come really left field in terms of that heritage asset. And you know, that could be a collection, or it could be a building, and that whole aspect needs grant support, which is why HES is in the background in terms of having repair and maintenance grants. But I think people have also realised that it's that whole visitor experience that's really important, and it's the visitor experience that enables you to think more enterprising. And that therefore that blended approach, whether you're looking at hospitality, events, learning, all of those things enable you to generate income that can support the long-term survival of your organisation and to grow and develop, much as Jane's talked about. So that I think that blend will always be needed in the heritage sector, particularly if you've got asset management and ownership within there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you.
No, thank you. I was interested when Jane was talking as well about putting that time and energy into developing high value products for visitors as well. And really, you know, I think one of the big challenges I think we often find in social enterprise more generally is our board of trustees join because of the social cause they're joining. And I wonder whether in heritage it's because of a particular building or its history, but actually what you require them to have knowledge and interest in is much, much broader, from the commercial aspect of product development to the financial side. And that's a tough call in terms of a board actually, and keeping their interest. And often I think people find that the stuff they have to get involved in is quite different to the thing that first drew them to perhaps joining the organisation at that level. So it's quite a challenge for organisations. I wanted to just pick up. Go on, sorry, Jane.
I was just going to say that's very true of our board. You know, you've got people who've joined because they love the castle, who've ended up having to be employers or, you know, make retail decisions and things. It is a really hard job for the trustees.
Yeah, it's I mean we touched quite a bit, and I think it's come out in both of your presentations about that sense of investment readiness. And actually one of the things I go on to show people in terms of looking at the investment readiness, and we've got tools and diagnostics and questions that we kind of try and work through with people, is actually sometimes it's worth trying to get yourself in a position of being investment ready before you're actually looking for investment. That chance then to be responsive and able to go for things quite quickly because you've already done the work to get a strong staff team, a strong board, a good sense of your financial position is really important. And I just wanted to pick up just perhaps as some of the final questions just about investment readiness and what are the kind of top tips you might give organisations that are really looking to make sure that they've got that broad approach both within their staff and their board team in terms of being ready to take on investment, whether that's a larger grant or a loan finance? Heather, perhaps to come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the most common things that we find is about the conservation piece. So if they're coming to us because they have an asset that needs some sort of work, or a building that needs some sort of development, that longer term thinking about conservation quite often is missing, the conservation and protection piece. And that's why I said it's really important to have the right team around you early. And getting that specialist knowledge, and you know, even coming into our grants team and say, where do I get that knowledge from? Who point me in the right direction, is better than going so far down that often it's difficult to unwind from that point, and then a grant application goes in and it's turned down because that area is not strong enough. I mean, that's particular to Historic Environment Scotland funding. The National Heritage Fund would probably come back with the same thing if it's a physical asset that's being involved in there. So I think that's one of the key areas, I think.
Thank you, Heather. Any just last little comments from you, Jane?
Yeah, I was going to say, Heather mentioned significance earlier, and that's one of the things we came a cropper with, because we didn't have substantially enough significance, evidence of our significance, when we went to the Heritage Lottery Fund, National Lottery Heritage Fund, for this project. You know, we had substantially enough significance for small projects, but when we came to this, and so we then ended up starting from scratch with our statement of significance, which we now have. But I think I would say to all organisations, don't underestimate the substantial amount of work that is to get that in place, and how that document needs to look, and the level of detail that's needed in it. Because, you know, like Heather says, we're asking for big money to pay for and there was a question that I had on the telephone with one of the grant officers, which was, I thought I'd explained the significance in my application, and she said, yeah, you did, but just remember who you're up against. You know, there are some huge organisations out there going for the same funding as you, who have very important buildings in the middle of Edinburgh and Glasgow and places, and we need to know what it is. You know what it is, but we need to know. So it's really just getting that down. I would say that was a really important piece. And the other one I would say is your decision-making process and your financial management process being documented properly and understood and signed by your trustees, so that there is not just me writing a piece of paper saying how we do things. It's actually something that's been endorsed and approved by the trustees.
Yes, I think, you know, like you say, whether it's, you know, the social investment side or it's larger grants from a grant funder, that's why I say the investment readiness piece we go through is actually relevant regardless of whether you're looking for loan finance. Absolutely. If you're going for substantial grant finance, the same checks and balances will need to be in place for funders in that area too. So it's why I always say, even if you're not looking at social investment, I guess stay on and look at the investment readiness piece. And I always say there's lots of help and support out there, whether it's the specialist knowledge in terms of going to organisations like HES, or whether it's generic business support knowledge, and there's lots of free support out there for social enterprises. And I've got lots of links to that in all of my upcoming slides, so hopefully they're helpful to people.
And there's so much to learn as well about your own heritage. And we had an on-site Zoom castle inspection meeting last week with HES, and it was fantastic. It was so interesting, and we had people sitting in offices all over Scotland at our castle helping us with our project, and you just learn so much that you didn't realise about your own heritage assets. So yeah, it's good.
Yeah,
I think I'll just pick up on the point that you made, Jane, about who you're competing with when you put in an application, and I think that's where the luck thing that I was referring to is also relevant. There's a limited pot at each round, regardless of funder, and who you're up against is one of those, that element of luck, depending on where that pot needs to go to at that particular time. So I think also resilience around applications is really important. If it doesn't go through the first time, don't be put off. Try again, come back, learn the lessons, and that element of luck might be on people's side in the future.
And also don't feel that it's something that you've done wrong. It's just something that you need to improve. I think that's, I started off when we get turned down for things feeling wretched and having to go to the trust and say we haven't got the money, and them saying why not, and then you realize it's all just part of a process, and you just have to be resilient.
It's always tough, isn't it? Because on the days when you have found out you've got the money, someone else has probably gone home and is feeling wretched, and that is it. And I think I always come back to this whole point about partnership, but I think it came through quite strongly in what you were saying as well, Heather, is actually we all want the organisations that are coming to us to succeed, because actually we share the same aims and objectives, whether that's the heritage objectives, the social impact objectives. And it is sometimes just a case of, it's that timing, are you quite ready? But we will help organisations to get there, because actually we want them to do well as much as they do. So I think that's always really important to remember. And I think perhaps the final thing I was just going to finish on is really reiterating what you were saying about that honesty and the trust again. Is I think sometimes we're very nervous if we've come from a background of asking for grant finance or money to never almost want to kind of say where something's not gone right. But actually my experience of being involved both with investment money and with grant funding is actually it's much easier to have a supportive relationship with the organisation you've given money to, if actually they are able to feel confident to pick up the phone and go, didn't quite go as planned, because actually then you've just got more people to help you through a situation, and it's much easier to bring in different bits of help at an earlier stage than it is to suddenly have someone ring up and go, oh, it's really gone wrong and we've tried everything, but by then it's too late. So I think that relationship, that honesty, and really working together is really key. So I don't think there's any last questions. Thank you both for your inputs today. I mean, we always say it's really valuable to hear from someone that's got that experience, and I think that always tends to be what we find. We've got the slides and the information, but when people hear that from someone that's been on the receiving side in terms of the questions, hopefully that builds other people's confidence, even if they don't feel quite ready to start asking the questions and coming forwards, and start building the relationships with people, even if you don't need the access to finance just now, is always the bit I would say. So thank you both. Thank you both very much. I'm crossing my fingers that my dogs don't start barking as I'm in my little bit of the presentation. It was great to have you both with us, and I'm going to crack on with the slides, otherwise I'll be in trouble with Toby for not leaving enough time for him as well. So
Cheers, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everyone. I hope you felt that really valuable. We always try to bring in the real experience from people that have received the money first. I think it's really valuable to hear it straight from organisations, and I was just going to take you through perhaps a little bit more of the detailed information around we've done our guest speakers, just around what else to expect in the last bits of the session. So I'm just going to run us through a little bit in terms of just running through what social investment is, why it came about, how it really is part of that wider finance mix, and really touching on some of those issues around investment readiness, partner selection, regardless of who that partner is. And then we're going to hand over just to Toby, looking at the community shares model. So just by way of a little bit of a background, and I've got lots of links, and we'll send the slides out. I've attached lots of links out to further bits of video. I know people don't want to just be sitting through lots of PowerPoints on an online session. The map on the right just gives you a sense of some of that broader ecosystem support if you're within the social enterprise sector. And if there's ever any questions about organisations in that, I'm happy for you to fire me across an email and I can pick up on that with you. But just I guess the key bit from this is since 2001 we've invested over £80 million in over 400 organisations from a variety of sectors. So we've got a real expertise now within the team or partners that we work with to really try and help projects from all kinds of backgrounds. And we've just launched our new strategy, and I'd encourage you to just look at that if you want to know a bit more about SIS and what we do. In terms of looking at introducing social investment, I often think it would be far easier if people just called it loan investment. And why don't they? I guess because generically social investment has actually been used to cover slightly broader range of models and tools for investment within the social sector. So we've got loans as well as kind of loans and blended finance. So the blended finance is often when some funders will give a mix of grant and loan support as part of one package. SIS have had programmes in the past where that's happened, and Resilience Scotland currently run a blended finance approach in 13 local authorities across Scotland as well. Community Shares Toby's going to take us through. I'm not going to go into too much detail about social investment tax relief today, but we've got some slides that are part of the broader slide pack that gets sent out after this, where you can find out a little bit more about social investment tax relief, how you would need to register as an organisation and what it does. But in essence, it's a tax relief for individuals that want to loan money for social purpose. The scheme is currently due to end in April next year, and there's a bit of a campaign to keep that going. And then I've got other initiatives under there. So perhaps some of the things around, some of you may have heard about social impact bonds, which in essence is often refers to schemes that are kind of payment by results. And for those organisations that perhaps might be set up as community interest companies limited by shares, there might be options around equity investment too. And I think what's interesting in looking at the most recent economic recovery plan that was put out by Scottish Government is they have within that a sense of looking at broader social investment within Scotland, and it'd be interesting to see how that transpires and one to keep an eye on. Where does it fit? Obviously, you can only take on a loan if you can pay that money back. I think it was Jane touched on a few different types of funding that she's had, or loan finance that she's had from SIS. Obviously, she talked a little bit about that when you've got grant money that's there, but you don't get upfront. And I'll touch on that a little bit in terms of looking at the bridging finance. But in essence, in order to take on investment, organisations would be looking at money they are earning to enable them to then pay back loan finance. So it tends to fit more for those organisations in our sector that perhaps have service level agreements, operate perhaps within the B2B market, or increasingly we're seeing more people operate in terms of the open market and wider consumers. I guess when we think about some of our heritage organisations and products that they're selling and developing, that's also kind of how are we reaching wider consumers in those kind of markets as well, and earning money from the products that we produce. So we've got different ways that social investment loans might be used. It could be used for buying an asset, a building perhaps, working capital. So again, Jane touched on working capital in the sense of they had projects that they wanted to do and they were looking at their cash flow forecasts and just needed, they needed money now to enable them to do what they wanted to achieve for future earning. And then we touched a little bit with Jane on bridging grants as well. So different ways. And I guess in essence, it's always around organisations that are really looking to invest in their communities, in themselves, to grow their business, perhaps to scale or diversify. So I guess it's why we always often align with kind of organisations that have that real sense of ambition and purpose. And I've got a couple of links there just in terms of a few videos focused on whether you were looking either at lending money for a building or for products and services. I said at the start of this, SIS aren't the only social investment provider, and when we talk about selecting a partner, I often think it's important to look at other providers as you go in to look at an investment. You can get social investment from the High Street Bank. Generally speaking, they prefer to lend with security to proven organisations, and it tends to be for much larger amounts of money. And social investment actually developed because a lot of people would go to their high street banks and often find that there was less understanding of what their organisation was trying to do. And as a consequence, I guess the phrase we'd use is computer says no. And to some degree, social investment came about to kind of fill that gap in the market where social organisations couldn't have much access to loan finance. But in the way that it now looks at loan finance, it does it in a slightly different way where we've got specialist providers. So they will lend money unsecured. They will lend it, it says new model there, I would say newer. You obviously need some sense of cash flow projections, which to some degree need to be based on some level of previous trading and understanding of where the figures in your cash flow projections have come from. But the key difference, I guess, is that we will lend money for smaller amounts. So in the case of SIS, we've got loans that have started from £10,000. I guess as I talk about kind of how we do it, you'll find many of the other social investment providers are very similar in their approach. I've put some links just on that slide there to goodfinance.org.uk. It gives a much broader range in terms of looking for other providers. And I've put a few links to other providers there on the screen. I think the other, perhaps last point I just wanted to say in relation to this slide is don't necessarily also see high street banks, social banks and the non-bank social finance providers as working in isolation. Occasionally it may be that there's been examples where maybe someone's been able to get 90% of the loan amount they were looking for against a security, and then someone like a social investor has been able to come in with the smaller end of the gap that's still left because they're willing to lend without the security. So it's always worth thinking about these things again in themselves as a bit of a blend. And then again, I've just put a little video link in terms of why do we need non-bank providers, and it talks a little bit about how social investment really evolved. These are perhaps picking up on some of the terms, drawing on SIS as an example. Like I say, other social investors will follow very similar models. Our loan finance has gone from £10,000 to the 1.6 million. That will be one thing that does vary with providers, but you will find it's quite common that fixed interest rates are used within our sector. People tend to be able to forecast their cash flows much better when interest rates are at a fixed rate rather than looking at variable. Short and long-term loans, for us, what does short mean? Generally, that tends to be what we refer to linked in with the bridging finance. So generally anything around that 18 months to 2 year kind of mark. And then long-term loans can be for that kind of more up to 25 years at the max, but are probably going to be somewhere between that 2 years and 15 years as a basic. The key thing I just wanted to pick up on here around secured and unsecured is really that thing about trustees' nervousness and an issue around personal liability. So we will not be chasing down directors of charities' houses or assets, personal assets, if things went wrong. And I think that's one of the real misconceptions. And the only caveat I ever put into that is obviously, as a general rule and a common rule, that the one thing your board will still need to be absolutely clear with is any rules around company law and issues around negligence. That's regardless of whether you're looking at social investment or not. So I wouldn't ever want to say no personal liability as a flippant remark, but just in the case of looking at social investment, there is no personal liability taken. Debt and patient terms, I think Jane talked about that quite well, and perhaps was demonstrated more recently about talking about the holiday as COVID hit, or perhaps as things didn't quite go as planned, being able to renegotiate payment schedules and how that worked. And I think Jane touched on having the first 3 years at that interest rate only kind of basis rather than the repayment, so that there was time for the income generation, I guess, to catch up with the spend. So it's always it's always important to look at that, and again, negotiate that with your investment manager. You know your business, they'll also have a good understanding from their experience of going through organisational cash flows. And then really just to touch on this relationship-based point, it's critical to who you choose to partner with. So I always say, how do you choose an investment partner? You're obviously going to look at cost of finance. It goes without saying. What rates are you offered? And, you know, many people will often talk about kind of interest rate levels with social investors. And again, I put a link to that in the slides. And I often say it's important to look at the cost of finance, obviously with the rate in mind, but also with the kind of what's the relationship and what's beyond the money. And again, I also say, you know, one of the things certainly that CIS does is there are no penalty charges for early repayment. So you may find that going to a social investor in the early stages, perhaps even if rates are slightly higher, gives you a sense of comfort. And once you've got more of a track record, maybe then your high street bank that would have said no has now changed their mind, and you can look to refinance. And those things are always open and are options. And the perspective we often give at CIS is obviously if money is repaid early, that just means it's then available to lend to someone else. So there's no sense of feeling like you can't do that. And I think that's always important to say. I always say what's provided beyond the money, the support, the patience, the access to other expertise. And I think that's always really important to understand. Many of the social investors will have staff teams that I guess have been there for a longer period of time, that know your business, and that can be really critical, I think, in terms of that going back for future finance and people really understanding how you work, who's involved and what you do. I always get people to think about volatility, and I always talk about that in terms of both in your own business and also in the investor's business in theirs. So, you know, having a partner looking at finance with you where maybe they're much more able to be flexible if your business plan doesn't go quite right is really important, knowing that you've got that, but also understanding volatility. I think I've touched on kind of the staff to some degree, knowing you've got one person who isn't always necessarily going to stay with the social investor for all of your loan period, of course. But, you know, maybe there's less change within a social investment organisation where they've got their funding finance from. They're not led by kind of national rules in quite perhaps some of the same way as I remember back to the 2008 financial crash, where suddenly obviously lots of smaller businesses had issues when the financial market crashed, and that was very difficult regardless of relationship. Rules were set in headquarters and got passed down. So it's always worth thinking about that volatility, I think. And then I guess the last point I always put is choice. You know, what choice do you actually have? So again, thinking that through in terms of both the now, but also will that change? So does the partnership with the social investor now build the confidence in the future for other people to lend to you that might not lend to you now? So don't just think about the short term. We've talked a lot, I think, in this session about kind of a finance mix and a blended model. And when I send the slides out, you'll see I've put quite a bit in some additional slides about perhaps trying to understand the advantages and disadvantages of grant finance versus loan finance, and trying to work out what might be right for you. I never present this as an either or. It's very much, I think, we talk about blended, and I think as someone that is there to provide loan finance, actually the fact that you've got an element of grant finance also gives some confidence and may reduce perceived risk as well. So it's always important to think about that finance mix. And I often say, whether obviously it's the heritage questions that Heather was picking up on in terms of looking after old buildings has a high cost, and that's the understanding that HES bring, is actually also understanding that if you're an organisation that has high social impact, that may not always be commercially viable. So you may need that real blend of grant finance and loan finance to balance the social and the enterprise aspects of your organisation. I talk a little bit about ownership, control and flexibility. What's your risk appetite? But also, what risks are you managing? I think it was interesting as Jane spoke that she said, just because it's grant finance doesn't mean there are no risks there. There's a risk of still doing project completion, doing all the reporting, and obviously loan finance, you want to obviously manage the risks around repayments. So it's always worth thinking, you know, broader about that question of risk. And I often also bring into this the questions around control and flexibility. So again, for me, and you'll see it when the full slides get sent out, one of the things I have to say is if you come to a social investor, you're presenting your business plan. We want obviously social impact and social goals. That's what makes us a social investor. But we haven't set a particular outcome in perhaps the same way as if you're applying to a particular fund that has a particular target it's trying to do. We're investing in your organisation and your business plan. So again, that can be slightly different. Partners and perception, again, I think Jane touched on that quite well. You know, does the fact that even if you had a small element of loan finance create a different perception externally that encourages other people to invest? Does the participation of a particular grant funder set you in a different way? So just always thinking about who you partner with in terms of how that then may change any perceptions that people may have around your organisation. And I always talk about the fit to business plan and focus. So it's not uncommon, I don't think, within the charity sector to sometimes end up having to chase the finance rather than chase the goals of your organisation. And we're always, of course, trying to align those, but there's a real sense of kind of looking at your own business plan and what you're trying to do. Is loan finance even an option? And I think, again, going back to some of the talks we heard earlier, if loan finance isn't right, we're not in the business of trying to persuade people to take on loan finance if it's not right for their organisation or not the right time. And while that may be tough if the answer was a no, actually that's all part of protecting the sector as much as supporting the sector. And then I talk about reporting and systems. Obviously, Jane talked about how her leap into kind of doing the more regular financial reporting was quite challenging at first. I think it's always just worth thinking what are the differences between reporting that might be required to a financial, to a social investor rather than the reporting perhaps to a grant funder, and just understanding that difference can be really helpful. And I guess the last one I've just put on there is just understanding, has the landscape changed? So what, given the current COVID climate, does that mean for funding and finance in your particular sector and your particular organisation? And also thinking, what is that likely to be doing in the next year, the next 3 years, and just trying to understand that in terms of positioning yourself for the future. And then the last bits just from me are just around looking at investment readiness. So I touch, in the next slide, I provide a link to a tool that we've got on the CIS website, our diagnostic tool. And it really focuses on these 6 key areas: social impact, governance, products and services, people skills, business planning, and financial control. So, you know, what is it that you're doing in each of these areas that is really meaning that you're ready for investment? And when you get sent the full slide pack, I give you an indication of some of the questions that we ask in each of these areas. How well is social impact embedded within your organisation? How do you measure it? Looking at governance, have you got people with financial skills, perhaps legal skills, commercial skills, as well as the social skills that you need? What's that broad range of people that you've got? And again, Heather touched on that both in terms of people and governance, I think, in terms of it's really important to have the right people in place at all levels across your organisation. Products and services, I think I was particularly encouraged to hear not just the talk of kind of looking at products, but high value products. So what is it that, have you really thought about your customers and your markets, and what is it that you're really trying to push and promote? Have you got that match to your audience and your target group right? Because that's going to be all the stuff that makes your business plan viable. And really understanding that in terms of both what you do now and what you're planning to do can be really valuable. And then obviously we have to look at things like financial control. So having worked with early stage and startup social entrepreneurs, it's not uncommon to see finance managed on a spreadsheet. By the time you were looking for loan finance, we were probably anticipating that you've got much more financial control in place than a simple cash flow management tool that you've designed on a spreadsheet. And really, but we're here to work with you on getting those financial controls right and helping you understand and develop those systems based on our experience, so that the support again is out there. So the link to the diagnostic tool is here. And just the last little bits from me. This isn't, if you're looking for social investment, regardless again of who you're going to, it's not a case of filling in lengthy application forms. Often it does really start with a conversation or an email and really starting to build that relationship with someone. They will give you a sense of whether it's a conversation that's worth pursuing, and if it is, then you really look to develop a proposal alongside an advisor working with you, and again it will go on to be considered by a committee, at which point it could be approved, declined, or it could just be that it needs more work. Maybe there's some bits around the plan that aren't quite right, or there needs to be systems put in place before things could happen. So we'd really work with you on that. And again, I've just put a few video links in here. The latter one, just in terms of the business plan, perhaps talks about that difference. Obviously, if you're coming for £10,000 versus coming for 1.5 million, we would anticipate there being different levels of information. So again, it's hard to give a standard answer on what really needs to be in a business plan for a loan application, but that video should give you a few ideas. And that was all I was going to just share with you for now, and I was going to hand over to Toby, who was going to take us through the community shares model. So straight over to you, Toby.
Yeah, thanks very much, Naomi, and good afternoon, everybody. I have a presentation here. I'll keep it quite brief because I think it's been quite a long session, and I'll do the kind of intro. We've got a little case study that's hopefully relevant as well, and then I'll point you to where you can get more information if you're interested. So like Naomi said, I'm Toby Sanderson. I'm from Community Share Scotland. So I'll be going over what community shares are, looking at some of the examples of how they've been used and what the process for using them would be, and then I'll say a little bit about the support that we offer and how we can help you if you're interested in looking at this further. So community shares, at their most basic, community shares are a way to raise money for community activities. I think you can think of them as a form of crowdfunding. So I imagine most of you are familiar with crowdfunding, where people, lots of people put in a certain amount of money each, and together that sum of money helps to make something big happen. So you might have seen sort of donations-based crowdfunding, where people are just donating money for a good cause. You might have seen rewards-based crowdfunding, where people put money in and they maybe get something back, like a t-shirt or a stamp or a badge or something, or they might be pre-ordering the product. Community shares is a little bit different. People are putting money in, but it's more like an investment. So the idea is that if everything goes to plan, if the business is successful, the people will get their money back, and they might also get some interest or other incentives to encourage them to invest larger sums of money. So community shares are really a very flexible form of finance. Really anything that you can convince people to invest in can be funded with community shares. In Scotland, we've supported lots of community shops. We're starting to see more community pubs and community hotels and things like that. Lots of community centres and things like renewable energy projects. And then we have some kind of unusual things like a community-owned distillery up in Dingwall. So really very open-ended in what this can be used for. So some of the kind of key facts about community shares. One of the big things is that to be able to legally issue community shares, you have to be a community benefit society or a cooperative society. And in Scotland, we tend to see more community benefit societies. So Community Share Scotland tends to work with more community benefit societies. Those are both very similar. They're both member-based organisations. So anyone who buys shares becomes a member. Members have voting rights. They can stand to be on the management committee, they can elect who is on the management committee, and they can exert some influence over things that way. So they do have a voice in the organisation, and the idea is that it's community-led and community-run, and the people who are using the organisation have some say over how it's run. That tends to work on a principle of one member, one vote. So regardless of how much money somebody puts in, whether they put in £10 or £10,000, everybody has an equal say, and you can't sort of buy influence by putting more money into it. One of the key distinctions between community shares and shares in private companies is that community shares are what's known as withdrawable share capital. And what that means is that you can't buy a community share and then go off and sell it to your friend or your neighbour and make a profit. The share itself always keeps the same value, and the only way you get your money back is to withdraw it from the society. So you go back to the society, say you paid £100 for your share, you would go back to the society in 3 or 4 or 5 years once the business is established, and you could get your £100 back. So community shares are a great way to raise money in their own right. We work with a lot of societies who completely fund their organisation through community shares. We've got some who are 100% community shares funded, and that's fine. But they also can be a really great way to attract further funding, particularly grant funding. I think a lot of the major grant funders look really favourably upon community shares because it's a way of demonstrating that your community have bought into what you're doing and people really support you. So some of the projects that we work with, community shares are making up quite a small chunk of the overall funding package. It might be as low as 5 or 10%, but it really gives that community buy-in. And in some cases, communities are using it just to have that sense of community built up. It's less about the money, and it's just to give people a sense of involvement and a sense of ownership over a project. So just a little bit more on that sort of legal stuff that I spoke about. A community benefit society is a specific legal structure. So much like you might be familiar with a company or a SKIO, community benefit society is a legal structure in the same sense. So it would be set up. It can employ staff. It can own assets and really do everything that a company can do. The slight difference is that it's registered with the Financial Conduct Authority rather than directly with Companies House, and it is governed by sets of what are called rules, which are really similar to the sort of articles of association of a company, but they can be a little bit more prescriptive in certain places around members' rights and things like that. And what tends to happen in practice, you could go to the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and set up a wholly new community benefit society. You could have a lawyer create your own rules and do all that yourself, but it would be costly and time consuming. So what tends to happen is that you get sets of what are called model rules, which have been put together by sponsoring bodies such as ourselves and have been pre-approved by the Financial Conduct Authority, and they're ready to go. They're basically templates that you drop your information into and send them off, and that speeds up the process and makes it a lot cheaper. There is a small fee involved in registering a community benefit society. It's you pay a fee to access a set of model rules, which would be up to £500. Our own rules are £200 to people that we're actively working with, and you'd also pay a fee to the FCA, which is dependent on how many changes you make, but in most cases it is less than £200 also. So probably a cost of about £500 to register a society. So like I said, community benefit societies can employ staff, they can own assets, they have limited liability for shareholders and for directors, so nobody's going to be on the line for debts if things don't go to plan. And they're also a really well respected form of community governance now. So really anything that you can do with a company in Scotland, you can do with a community benefit society. They're eligible for Scottish Land Fund, for Community Right to Buy, Community Asset Transfer. They're named in the Scottish Community Empowerment Act, so they are a really respected and recognised form of governance now. And there is also the option for a community benefit society to be charitable. So if you're undertaking charitable activity and you can pass the Oscar charity test, you can have charitable status as a BENCOM, which might be relevant to some people. The last point there is that if you're an existing organisation, say you're already set up as a company or as a SKIO, you've got a couple of options really. You can either completely overhaul your existing organisation. You can transfer your existing organisation to become a society in its own right. That's quite a quick process for a company. That's quite straightforward for a company. A little bit more complicated if you're a SKIO or a charitable organisation, but still possible. Or the other option is that you can have some sort of formal written links between the two. So you can't have a situation where the existing organisation completely controls the society, because the society has to have member control, but you can have formal written links between them. So you can have agreements that you'll share profits and that you'll have shared directors and things like that, to have some influence retained by the existing organisation. So I've got a quick case study here. This is looking at the Cultibragan prisoner of war camp up near Comrie. So this has been owned by the community for I think about 10 years now. And it was originally taken on by the local development trust, and they have a variety of activities taking place in the space. So that they've got a sort of heritage trail museum. They've adapted some of the huts into business premises that they let out to various local businesses. They have lots of community spaces, like a men's shed in the community orchard, and they're really just trying to make the most of this space, which was obviously once owned by the MOD. So they issued shares in 2015 for a part of the site that they wanted to develop into self-catered accommodation for visitors, and they raised almost £30,000 from 148 members. They were set up with model rules which have become sort of a precursor to a set of model rules that we issued, and those are, on that last point I made, they've been developed with development trusts in mind to help any organisation that's already set up and has a specific project in mind that they would like to issue community shares for. And I won't go into the technical details, but I'm happy to discuss that in more detail if anyone is interested. And this is another example of an organisation that has a lot of other funding. So community shares are quite a small part of their funding. They've also had grant funding from Historic Scotland and the National Lotteries Heritage Fund and various others. But community shares have really helped them to get that sort of last piece of the jigsaw, as we would sort of put it. So Community Share Scotland, we've been around since 2014, which is when the current legislation around community benefit societies came into action. And we're set up with the function to firstly raise awareness and understanding of community shares. So doing lots of events like this and helping people understand what it's all about. But we also offer really hands-on support and guidance to anybody who wants to issue community shares. So we have a team based here in Edinburgh, myself and my colleague Morven. We would do the sort of early stage support with you. So if you're interested in learning more about community shares, if you want to work out how it actually works in detail, you want to work out if it's right for you, you can come and chat to us, phone, email, whatever's most appropriate for you, and we can help you to understand how it would all work and whether it's a good option for you. If we both decide it's a viable, a sensible thing for you to do, we can bring in funded consultancy support to help you to put together a share offer. And that can be up to 6 days with a trained community shares practitioner, someone who's really experienced and has done this all before, and focused on your business plan, thinking about how it will all work out financially and how you pay for everything, looking at your marketing and community engagement, so thinking about who would buy shares, why they would buy shares, how you're going to contact them all, looking at your governance, so things like registering your community benefit society and getting all that legal structures in place, and finally putting all that together into your share offer document, which is the document that goes out to your potential investors and gives them all the information they need to decide whether or not they'd like to invest. We can also offer a grant of up to £5,000, which helps with the marketing costs of the share offer. So any sort of advertising, or it's been used for events in the past, it's been used for websites. It's quite an open-ended grant, and I'm happy to speak about the various things that are eligible. And we also work closely with lots of other organisations. So we encourage people to get in touch with us really as soon as they have an idea, or as soon as they have a thought about something that could potentially be funded through community shares. Come chat to us. We won't turn anyone away. We'll always try and find you the support that's out there. And I think maybe most important for a lot of groups is that everything we offer is fully funded. We don't charge anything to access our support. Also, just last point here, we've just launched a brand new website. So we've now got a sort of interactive tool where you can explore the sort of process of a community share offer, which I think some people can struggle to understand where it starts and where it ends. So hopefully the idea with this is that you can click through and see the various steps that are involved. So please do go check that out. That's really the end of my quick presentation. Various contact details there. All these slides will be sent around, so you'll have all that information. And please do get in touch if you're interested. But happy to take any questions now as well.
Thank you very much, Toby. It's always interesting, I think, seeing the community shares model. I know when we first started bringing you in on the kind of, I guess, sessions looking broader than just grant finance, that a lot of people still hadn't heard of community shares, and I'm pleased to see that's really starting to change. But it can be a really good one. Perhaps just, I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions and then we'll perhaps draw to a close. But in the same way that we touched on the social investment, just looking at what do you think are some of the broader advantages around bringing in community shares, could you just perhaps touch on kind of where you see the community shares model, kind of, I guess, coming back to that perception point, and how does it make groups be seen?
Yeah, there's lots of advantages, and I mean, I think the obvious one is that you can raise money quickly and from your own community, and it can be, you know, it's your money to do with as you wish. It's not like a grant that's tied to any specific costs. It's not like a loan that has to be, you know, that's got payment windows immediately. It's your organisation's money. And it's sort of dependent on everything going well. So if things don't go well, it's not debt. It's not going to be, nobody's on the hook for it. It's also a really great way to build up support within your community. So I think, you know, if anyone buys shares in a community organisation, they're literally invested in it and they want to see it successful. So we see that a lot with community shops that we've supported. If someone pays even a small amount of money, even £50 into a community shop, I think because they've paid that money in, they want to make sure the shop is successful. So they shop there and they tell their friends to shop there, and, you know, they get involved on social media, and you really build up this kind of supporter base that you might not have in other circumstances.
Yeah, and I think we've talked in the past as well, haven't we, about kind of how actually, even if you're then going on to apply for grant funding as well, it's a great way of demonstrating that you've got the community on board with what you're trying to do. So
absolutely, and we have some examples of communities who've been offered conditional grants from the likes of the lottery, where, you know, they've said, yes, we'll give you X amount of money, but only on the condition that you raise X amount in community shares. And that can be a really strong selling point to a community, because you can put in your share offer document, you know, for every £1 you invest, it's worth 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to us. And I think that's a real strong selling point in a lot of share offers we see.
Yeah, no, thank you, Toby. And then I guess the last question I was just going to ask today, and it's one that always comes up, is perhaps can you, obviously we talk about kind of crowdfunding as well and community shares, can you perhaps draw out a little bit more in terms of perhaps some of the difference between mainstream crowdfunding approaches and the community shares approach?
Yeah, so I think I touched on it a little bit. I mean, I think community shares is it falls under the umbrella of crowdfunding. Running a community shares campaign is very similar. Well, it really is the same as running a crowdfunding campaign. I think the pitch is the same, and I think the way people understand it is the same. The difference is that people are shareholders and have some ongoing involvement with the organisation, and are part of that community. And yeah, I think as well, crowdfunding, as most people know, it tends to be the donations and rewards-based crowdfunding that I mentioned, where you're not getting such big sums of money because the gain for the individual is less. Whereas community shares is more of an investment, and there is an opportunity to get your money back and possibly to get some interest. And I think you can start to see people invest in much bigger sums. You know, we've seen share offers where people start to invest into thousands of pounds. So there's the potential to raise a lot more through community shares, I think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I know in one of our previous, I think it was the retail one where we talked about raising investment for retail initiatives. We touched quite a lot in terms of the reward structure there. And I think there were some examples of kind of going, we almost came up with too fancy reward structures. And I think there was one where someone said, you know, actually what they were trying to do was set up it was Brewgood are actually talking about how they were doing a clean water campaign through, in essence, they produce clean lager. Is kind of how they started, but talking about how I think in their early days they did a reward where it was like come and have dinner with the founder, and then suddenly they find that everyone sat there kind of going, why are we doing this? And even the participants were. So again, if you are going down that route, really think through your kind of rewards in terms of.
I think we have seen groups who've sort of overshot with things like that, and ones who've, you know, for shops offered things like 10% discount to members, which is it's a nice idea in principle, but I think it ends up becoming, it's not a discount to members, it's a premium to non-members, you know, because they have to charge the right price for things to make the business work. So yeah, it's important not to sort of overcommit yourself with those sorts of rewards.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Toby. I've got one last little bit I just want to share with you, just what to expect when the slides come out and just some helpful links. And then that's us done then for today. So the last bit is literally just to give you a sense of what the slideshow just has. So I've got some useful links when this comes out to the Good Finance site, to Resilience Scotland, Community Shares, but to Just Enterprise and First Port around some of the support that's out there. And then we've got the social investment tax relief that I said I touched on, and some links to the Big Society Capital there about what the SITR scheme is. And then I've just put in some additional slides around kind of the benefits of investment versus some of the challenges, the link to the personal liability video, and then, as I mentioned, just some of these questions around that come from our diagnostic tool around social impact, governance, product services, people and skills, business plan, and financial control. So I'm not going through them all in this session now, but they'll come through in the slides, and you'll find them on the diagnostic tool if you log in. So that's us done for today. I'll stay on a couple of minutes if there's any final questions. But thank you all for coming along, and thank you once again to Toby, to Jane, and to Heather for participating in today's session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.